The United States has both the largest and the most powerful military, but it also has the most punitive carceral system in the history of the modern world. Today, the United States prison population is estimated to be about 1.2 million. Since the American war in Vietnam, the number of veterans who've been incarcerated after military service has steadily increased to about 100,000 today. The reason why these large numbers of veterans find themselves behind bars is an issue that my next guest is most critical of. Jason Higgins is an assistant professor and digital scholarship coordinator at Virginia Tech University in Blacksburg. In the last 12 years, he conducted a dozen of oral history interviews with incarcerated veterans and their families. His new book, Prisoners After War, Veterans in the Age of Mass Incarceration, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press, and it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Enjoy the show. Dr. Jason, thank you so much for making the time and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mr. Tita. How are you today?
I'm doing very great. I'm happy that it's Patriots Day here, so we don't have to work at all. I'm just in the office. I'm just keeping on with my work. But as we start our discussion and our talk about your new book, I just want you to just briefly talk about the work that you do currently now at Virginia Tech. I understand you're a digital scholarship coordinator and assistant professor at the very same time. So could you just briefly share us, or maybe your brief background, your research interests, and what you're currently doing?
Okay. So my position is at the rank of assistant professor. I work in publishing. So I do a lot of open access publication. So your audience members, if they're international, we try to make this content accessible for free. There are inequalities within that, as you know, but we try to bridge academic expertise with the public. And that has really been central to my work for a very long time, because I come from a working class background. I'm from Southeast Arkansas, first generation. So I'm the first person in my family to go to college. And I have a PhD now from UMass Amherst. We were there together. And I remember, I would be writing my dissertation, the early form of this book, and I would bump into you in the office diligently working at, I believe you had just started this show around that same time.
Yes.
Which it's been amazing to watch it grow and expand. The work I'm doing now, I do teach through the history department. It's a jointly affiliated position. I teach the American War in Vietnam. I teach African American history, and I teach oral history.
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing oral history interviews for about 12 years now. I've interviewed about 120 veterans, U.S. military veterans mostly, many of whom were in the American War in Vietnam, and then to the global wars on terrorism.
Wow. That's excellent work. I can remember, because I remember that when I came here in 2019, I think just a month after I came, or maybe I think it's September. It's the very same month that I came. We went to the United States Naval War College, where I remember that you presented some of the findings for this particular book, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
So yeah, I remember that history. I wanted I should give a shout out to Dr. Matt Becker. I talked to him a few weeks ago. I was at UMass Press, and he's the one who gave me a copy of your book before I went to see Professor Chris Api to take a good picture of that. I will show it to the audience right here, and I'm sure that they will love it. But let's start to talk about this book. I understand you tell us that there are thousands of American veterans of different wars that have found themselves in a situation where after war they find themselves incarcerated, like
That's right.
long-term sentences and all that experience. What would you say are the core ideas of this book, and what is its central argument?
The book explores the ways that veterans come home from war and experience many social problems that lead to prison or jail. Oftentimes, it's related to mental health. So, post traumatic stress disorder was only recognized in 1980, but Vietnam War veterans were coming home with symptoms related to mental illness, mental health problems. Um, Oftentimes, they use drugs or in particular black veterans. So African American Vietnam veterans would be discharged from the military sometimes without benefits. So less than honorable discharges would render them ineligible for veterans benefits through the government. So things like going to college, so the GI Bill, educational benefits, going to the hospital, the Veterans Hospital, to seek treatment for disabilities. Black veterans were disproportionately denied all of that care because of the type of discharge that they received. It was also a time of high unemployment rates. A lot of these people already came from poor backgrounds, working class people. As you know, the Vietnam War was fought by working class people against poor Asian communities, right? So it was in many ways, it was the fight itself was poor people fighting one another. And they would come home to their communities without many opportunities and fall oftentimes into these cycles of crime. And then in the United States in particular, uh, what I would describe as intergenerational trauma. So veterans who came home from war in the Vietnam War went to prison who had children, their families had to grow up in the aftermath of incarceration and trauma and sometimes domestic violence and all of these problems that lead to today. So the book tries to capture that experience across generations between the Vietnam War and the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the types of experiences they have change over time, of course. But what I argue is that uh, veterans sometimes experience discriminatory treatment through the government, through the military, and through the Veterans Administration.
Mm-hmm.
It could be racial discrimination. It could be discriminating punishment against people with mental health problems.
Mm-hmm.
It could be women who were sexually assaulted in the military.
Mm-hmm.
All of these types of traumas impact people for years after their war experiences. As you probably know, uh, the experience of war doesn't end with
Yes.
the
With the
battles
end of
on the battle.
conflict. Yes.
Yeah, at the end of the
Mm-hmm.
conflict, they live with those memories for the rest of their lives, and they impact their families, they impact their communities, and so my book interviewed veterans who experienced those types of problems and found a lot of patterns.
Mm-hmm. 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 Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. So now, you said you've interviewed lots, hundreds and hundreds of like veterans. Um,
Yes.
how were you able to, to access, these people and to get them to talk about their experiences over this long period of time?
That's a great question. I started off whenever I was in college, I would interview veterans who were in my community. I come from a very small town.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed a Marine veteran who was in the Second World War in the
Mm-hmm.
Pacific Theater.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started interviewing Vietnam War veterans, and it's grown since then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Most of the veterans in this book were formerly incarcerated. So these were
Oh,
not currently incarcerated veterans. They had been out of the prison system. And
okay.
social media is very powerful, as you
Oh,
know.
yes, yes,
And,
yes.
and and so I would interview people in the local community,
Mm-hmm.
and then people often found me online to share their
Oh,
stories because no one was really asking these types of questions. It's a
oh,
topic that historians have largely neglected, but
yes.
veterans themselves are familiar with it. They know this history in ways that the public doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another core argument of the book is that while most people don't remember the history of incarcerated veterans and scholars have not written about this topic before me,
Mm-hmm.
veterans themselves have been organizing for a very long time to raise recognition to the problems that veterans face after coming home, including going to prison.
Oh, oh, nice, nice. Thank you so much. I was very concerned about that because I understand, you talk about incarceration. So I did want to know if you were just focused on people incarcerated or, those that were out of, incarceration.
Well,
Uh,
there are ethical problems with interviewing people who are imprisoned.
mm,
They don't have much control over their
oh,
lives and
yes,
their
yes.
stories. So I was very mindful of that. I
Mm-hmm,
have interviewed people who were incarcerated, but none
mm-hmm.
of those are public. I kept them all private.
Uh-huh.
The people who I share their stories in the book and online in some situations, I always have permission. I always reach back out and make sure that I have explicit permission to include their names.
Mm-hmm.
The people I interview review the transcripts or the videos, and if they
Mm-hmm.
want anything taken out for privacy, I edit them.
Okay, that's very important. Thank you so much for that. So now, when I read your book, I got the idea that it feeds into two important discourses: veteran studies and the discourse on mass incarceration. What would you say is the major contribution you make to that discourse that already exists, especially in the context of the United States?
I'm the first one to bring those conversations together. the
Mm-hmm.
both of these fields and people who study war and people who study incarceration don't talk to one another usually. They're not drawing from the same previous scholarship. They're not attending the same conversations at the same conferences. So people who study military history are not usually studying mass incarceration. And that's also a bigger problem in the field of military history in the United States because a lot of the focus is done by and about white men. And carceral studies has focused because mass incarceration affects Black people in the United States most, it's focused on Black history. And so I bring those two together in ways that draw inspiration from a lot of different fields of study, whether that be Black studies or African American history, history of the Vietnam War, class, disability studies. I'm very concerned with mental health, so trauma studies, and gender as well. So I kind of break each chapter into focusing on this topic through a specific type of lens. So like I'm talking about like institutional racism in the first chapter in the Vietnam War with Black men. I talk about the war on drugs and the changes at the policy level that affect veterans after coming home from war in Vietnam. That's whenever the war on drugs is introduced. And then I'm talking about memory. I'm talking about collective memory. How do Vietnam veterans remember that war?
Mm-hmm.
And I argue that Vietnam veterans have been organizing a grassroots movement for mental health reform. And they've been engaged in this work for a very long time, since the 1970s. But
Mm-hmm.
if you go to courtrooms across the United States, there will be veterans volunteering in these courts trying to be a mentor to younger generations of veterans who are in the criminal justice system. So, Vietnam veterans who are mentoring Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans. So, and then the rest of the book focuses on the 21st century, post 9/11, that generation of veterans and the challenges that they face that are unique to them, but also their ongoing problems that Vietnam veterans faced as well,
Mm-hmm.
such as traumatic brain injury. So, because
Mm-hmm.
of the nature of fighting a global war on terrorism, the number of deployments and tours of duty that these American veterans had to
Mm-hmm.
experience was very different from the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so there's a lot of different types of change over time, but also consistencies. It rhymes. Like
Mm-hmm.
the history is not exactly the same, but the
Mm-hmm.
patterns are recognizable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I want you to give me some examples of the stories that you write about. Maybe the stories of one or two veterans that were, very significant for you and for your analysis, for the benefit of of our audience.
Sure. The first one that two comes to mind, but one I'll talk about. His name was Ari Sezu Meredazan. He changed his name because his birth name was Haywood Kirkland. He rejected that as a slave name. He thought that name was stemmed from the roots of American slavery. And his story is told and a very important oral history of Black Vietnam veterans called Bloods by Wallace Terry. This is a really popular book. And he came home from the war in Vietnam radicalized. So a lot of Black men in Vietnam from the United States saw the conditions of the violence in Vietnam and had a lot of solidarity between the Vietnamese people and what they were experiencing and what Black men in the United States faced. Racism on both fronts. This is still the ongoing civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. And Moretazan came home in the summer of 1968 in the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination. So Martin Luther King had been this icon of nonviolence. He spoke out against the war in Vietnam in 1967, and it was during a campaign against poverty in the United States that he was killed for his beliefs. And Moretazan had just come home from the violence of Vietnam back to Washington, D.C., and the city was on fire. So rebellions had sprung up across the United States in that summer. Um, and he was dealing with mental health. He was dealing with the feeling of being exploited and used to fight a white man's war. And he came home, and his community was suffering from poverty, from violence. And he got a job, and this job allowed him to learn about how the United States government burned old currency. So currency that was, older, they would take it and they would burn it. They would
Mm-hmm.
incinerate the currency, and he planned to rob a vehicle that was transporting this money
Mm-hmm.
um, with other Vietnam veterans. He donated a lot of his portion to the Black community,
Mm-hmm.
some medical centers, colleges, food programs. So, in some ways, that was an act of reparations to him. He understands that act is part of a long tradition of activism that he's been engaged with throughout his life. But he went to prison for that.
Mm-hmm.
He went to prison at Lorton Reformatory in Washington, D.C., with a 99% Black population.
Mm-hmm.
So it was highly racialized. And that's when he started organizing Vietnam veterans who were in that prison because he recognized that they weren't getting disability rights. Their needs weren't being met.
Mm-hmm.
So he started writing letters, and the media broke a story on his experience, and he met with the president. So he met with President Jimmy Carter while he was
Oh,
incarcerated. So
oh.
he went to the White House, and then after that, President Carter issued the Department of Justice to study incarcerated veterans. So it was the first time that the government had tried to investigate how
Mm-hmm.
many people had been in the military who went to prison. So that was the first
Oh.
time. And those studies continue today. The most recent one was published in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the legacies of his activism is getting
Wonderful.
the government to actually try to document how many veterans
Exactly.
were in prison. And then he testified to Congress in
Mm-hmm.
1979, and it confirmed what the first study showed, that one quarter of the American prison population were military veterans,
Mm-hmm.
and half of them were Black men with disabilities, Black
Mm-hmm.
veterans with disabilities. So there's an incredible inequality within the system.
Mm-hmm.
But it was
Mm-hmm.
really veterans like Moredazan who started raising awareness to it,
Mm-hmm.
organizing, testifying to the government, getting laws passed to address their needs, getting disability rights. And then Moredazan was really responsible for replicating a model for veterans in prison to start advocating for one another.
Mm-hmm.
So his legacy is really powerful, and he's the last one that I interviewed, but he was the first one that I read about because he changed his name. I couldn't find him. I couldn't find who
Oh,
was Haywood Kirkland.
oh yes.
And then I was connected with this guy who I heard about had a similar
Uh-huh.
experience, and I figured it out. Oh, this is the same person. And I
Uh-huh.
interviewed him. His full interview, we did four different interviews. It's online at my YouTube
Oh,
channel, and you can
nice,
watch
nice,
that. So
nice,
you can connect my YouTube channel if you want,
nice.
and
Oh,
people
definitely,
can, yeah,
definitely,
and your audience can watch those interviews.
definitely. I'll make sure that I put a link, on the description panel when I get to upload this video. So I can tell that these veterans go through a lot of severe suffering, both during the war, after the war, during incarceration, after incarceration. What would you say, or how do you characterize the possibilities of reform and reparative justice? Something you also like talk about in the book. What is it that should be done, and what is it that should not be done?
That's a fantastic question. Um, Well, I mentioned Moredazon and how
Mm-hmm.
he advocated and organized,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't until 2008 before the criminal justice system had substantial reforms to address the needs of veterans in the prison and jail systems in the United States. But the Vietnam Veterans of America is a national organization of Vietnam veterans who organized and lobbied for disability rights, compensation for exposure to Agent Orange, which caused cancer among Vietnam veterans after they come home. They've been, advocating for incarcerated veterans from their very beginning. And while most Americans don't know anything about incarcerated veterans, veterans themselves have been pushing and advocating and trying to provide resources to veterans in the criminal justice system. And what I argue in the book is that these veteran treatment courts are an extension of that long time activism that Vietnam veterans have been engaged with since the war. In 2008, the first veteran treatment court was founded, and it grew with the founding members of that court who were Vietnam veterans. So the model is that veteran treatment court provides federal resources to people at local courts. So I don't know how familiar your audience might be with American law, but the federal government and the state government and local governments all have these boundaries between them, right? So what this court did was it brought federal money, federal funding, federal resources into a local courtroom to provide help for these veterans to avoid going back to prison or jail. So that's the powerful thing that it did. It allowed the Veterans Administration Hospital to provide counseling. So, someone who can help these veterans deal with mental health, job training, um, programs that would get people working, connect them to universities to get people access to their education, their GI Bill, disability benefits, food, housing, and then on top of that, these veterans who oftentimes served in the Iraq War or the Afghanistan wars, they are connected with a Vietnam veteran who is a mentor to them. So you have these generational connections who can provide support, and that's very meaningful to these veterans. They're reconnected to a sense of camaraderie, um, and it's revolutionary in a certain way because the it has the lowest recidivism rates in the United States criminal justice system. So the recidivism meaning like the people who go back to prison after they get out, for your audience. And it is the model, I think, for reform. It will, help address inequality um, in the United States prison systems. However, the number of people who benefit from these programs is very limited. People who are convicted of violent crime, which is the majority of veterans, more veterans commit violent crimes than any other group. For civilians, it's drugs, but with veterans, it's violence, and they don't qualify usually. If they have a felony, they don't qualify for treatment, which I think is we need to reconsider that in many cases. Not every state has them. There are unequal drug laws in the United States. So if you're in the South and you get caught with marijuana, you can serve prison time, and veterans do if they're convicted under the harshest penalties, and that's another part of the inequality. But marijuana is legal in Massachusetts, so and the fact that you can be prescribed marijuana by doctors and yet still go to jail for it is inequality in that system, right? So I have to be cautionary about how revolutionary this can be because reforms that only benefit a small number of military veterans will not benefit everyone. However, what they do show is how effective it can be to provide counseling benefits, job training, employment, university access, disability compensation to people involved in the criminal justice system. And what I would argue is that most of the people in the United States prison system have experienced trauma. They usually come from poor backgrounds. They fall into cycles of trauma, poverty, and crime, and it's racialized. The black men in America are far more likely to go to prison than I am, and I recognize that. So for any greater reform to come from this history of incarcerated veterans must deal with ongoing historical and present racial inequality. It has to
Mhm,
happen.
mhm, mhm,
But the changes that led to mass incarceration were really happening at the same time as the Vietnam War. So President Johnson had a war on poverty, and President Nixon had a war on drugs. And
mhm.
all of those resources that were helping poor people in communities were diverted toward prisons, to police, to the criminal justice system. But that has not worked. It has only led to millions of people in the prison system. And
Mhm.
what these courts do is the opposite of that. They take federal money, they put it back into the community, they provide training, housing, all of these social
Oh,
welfare
yes.
programs that people need. And so like it reverses it. And it's a clear indication that that model works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. That's so wonderful. Thank you so much for that. My last question for you. Um, what's the target audience of this book? I understand, when you were writing, I want you to think about when you were writing it. Who did you think you were writing it for? And after you had completed the book, who did you think would best enjoy it if they get their hands on
Hmm. I love that question because from the very beginning, I thought this book could reach the public.
it? Mm-hmm.
I thought that it could benefit veterans. But as you know, you are
Mm-hmm.
an academic historian.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you write a dissertation, there's really only a couple of people who are going to read that. So my
Yes.
advisor, Christian Oppie, who is an expert on the Vietnam War, he was my audience for a long time. And then I have to take something that's written for an academic audience and
Uh-huh.
try to make it accessible to the public and especially to veterans.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I revised the book, I really tried to write it in language that anyone could read. I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned that I'm the first person to go to college in my family. I
Mm-hmm.
would love for a family member to be able to read this
Yes, yes.
at that
That's
level. So
mm-hmm.
I tried to achieve that, but I don't know how successful I was.
Mm-hmm.
The book is open access, so anyone in your audience,
Mm-hmm.
anywhere in the world, can download my book and read it for free.
Oh,
Um,
definitely.
and I
Definitely.
want that to be something that can make a greater impact beyond a few historians who study war or
Oh,
mass
yes.
incarceration.
Yes.
So
Yes.
the challenge is you have to appeal to both. you
Mm-hmm.
know, the academics and the public
And the
and
general public.
veterans.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's impossible to do it all. So not everyone will be happy, I don't think, with my
Yes.
book, but
Yes.
I hope that everyone could learn from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much for that. Viewers and listeners, if you would want to access a copy of Dr. Jason Higgins' book, you can access it right on the link that I'm going to paste in the description panel on the upload for this video. Dr. Jason, thank you so much for making the time.
Tita, please call me Jason. And I look forward to reading your book and whenever the day I get to call you doctor as well. Thank you so
Sure,
much.
sure thing. That should be very soon. I'm looking forward to it as well.
I bet.